Hi, and thanks for joining us for this session on mastering the next generation of Oregon science standards. My name's Francis Vigent. I'm a CEO here at KnowAtom. We are an organization based just north of Boston. We focus on higher order thinking skills. We are former teachers, and I myself am a former teacher. I started as a high school math teacher and then transitioned to being an elementary and middle school STEM specialist prior to being here at KnowAtom. And we, as teachers, really enjoy the next generation science standards, mainly because when you're teaching in a classroom, your goal isn't to make every child a scientist or an engineer, but your goal is really to change their thinking, develop their skills to be able to think critically, and specifically creatively, evaluatively, analytically, and open opportunities for them, whatever they choose as a college or career down the road. So when you think about the next generation science standards and science and engineering in general, developing those types of skills and creating those kinds of opportunities are something that the classroom now has sort of even more permission to do, in a sense, because the next generation science standards require placing children in the role of scientist and engineer in the classroom and really putting their thinking on the forefront of really as the tool of engagement. And I think very few people maybe think of it that way, but I think science and engineering, oftentimes people think of engaging activities as being sort of fantastic or in some way almost like things that move and blink or relate to something that's my life, backpacks or lunch boxes and things like that. Sometimes there can just be a bit of a disconnect because it's adults really trying to figure out what children find relevant. But with the next generation science standards, it's the children taking what they find relevant and bringing it to life within the context of the content with skills they've developed as an opportunity to view the phenomenon and really demonstrate understanding of these new standards. So curriculum materials professional development, that is just a tool to support and create that learning environment, that experience, that next generation inquiry environment. So I say all of that because our focus for the last 10 years has been equipping schools and districts, so not through professional development teachers, but we don't work directly with teachers in the sense of selling aligned curriculum to them or anything like that. We deal with schools and districts when they do their adoption processes and things. But what's really interesting is that the recommendations that were made by the National Research Council, the National Academies, and sort of gave birth to the next generation science standards and so on, have been something that we've been developing into our curriculum basically in parallel with the releases by the partner states and the reports prior, simply because it's great teaching. It's really great teaching, and great teaching produces great learning outcomes. And so we have a history of data using these types of methods as well as different dimensions that show impact even on unaligned testing, which is really a dramatic impact. I'll show you some of that at the end. If you're on the live session, I just want to let you know before we jump into this webinar, you'll have a question box on your screen. You're welcome to drop questions in there. I appreciate questions, love to answer them. And I'll try to save a little bit of time at the end. We're going to run about an hour, and if you don't get your questions answered or need to leave, please reach out to Mary Ellen or myself, and one way or another your questions will get to me and I'll do my best to respond personally. So this next hour I want to focus on four main things. So these four things are what makes the new standards a bit tougher in Oregon as we think about the transition from OAKS to an NGSS aligned assessment, and classroom resources that aren't aligned to ones that are, and really what's in between it all is upskilling and transitioning skill sets from traditional model of instruction in the classroom to a next generation model in the classroom where that doesn't already exist. Take a look at how those standards link to Common Core, ELA, and math, how this transition is really going to affect pedagogy, top to bottom, K-12, and how what we're teaching in STEM, so when we refer to STEM, I mean science, technology, engineering, and math, integrate not only with the Common Core, but also with arts, but as well as history and social studies and social justice. There's a lot of different dimensions, but the standards themselves, particularly with the arts, there's some interesting connections here. When you think about Oregon's classroom implementation timeline that's been recommended by the state at this point, I guess just in a macro scope, so in 2014, the Board of Education adopted the new standards, the NGSS, as the new Oregon Science Standards, and the focus of 2015-16 was to begin the implementation of NGSS K-12 at the classroom level, and then 2016-17 to continue that implementation and bring awareness about this transition from OAKS, which is not aligned, to NGSS, which is aligned, or I guess testing, which is NGSS aligned. I'm going to show you some examples of what that looks like. And 2017-2018, the goal is to be really fully implemented in the classroom, and you should expect that 2017, 2018, 2018, 2019 would be field testing as an implementation of the whatever the new version of the OAKS ends up being, because that's typically how these timelines work for each of the states. There's essentially a 3-year implementation window for the classroom, and then a year or two into that, there begins a 3-year window to implement NGSS aligned testing. Now, some of that has to do with No Child Left Behind waivers and the EC legislation, but more or less, it's just something you should expect, because as science is being tested, you don't want to test something that you're not teaching. So instruction is shaped by the standards, and so learning is shaped by the standards, and so to really be able to evaluate learning outcomes and the quality of instruction, we need to be assessing the standards that are in force and not those of yesteryear. So that is something that's coming down the pike. But let's take a look at these larger transitions and some of the, I guess, essential questions people are struggling with. And there's somewhat of a national exodus right now among science communities, where people are searching and not necessarily knowing where to find or what to find, what they're looking at, whether it is science or there's just so much going on. So the foundation of these new science standards is the nature of science and engineering itself, and that's why it's been defined in the standards documentation. So the nature of science and engineering is really a cycle, that there is a kind of STEM cycle where, and this is the definition from the standards, not our own definition. So science is knowledge from experimentation. Scientists ask questions and they answer them by developing hypotheses that they test, gather data, and form conclusions about. That's what yields scientific knowledge. Scientific knowledge is used by engineers. Engineers identify and solve problems using that knowledge. They develop prototypes of solutions, they test them, they gather data, they form evidence-based conclusions around those prototypes as to whether or not they actually solve the problem. So when you consider that is how technology is developed, because technology solves problems. That's the definition of technology. So this becomes full circle when you consider that engineered technology helped scientists answer questions that they couldn't answer previously. Also, by virtue of doing that, ask questions that they were sort of unaware of, they hadn't thought of yet. And so that drives scientific knowledge forward, and that then gives engineers new scientific knowledge to use to solve problems. So for instance, as scientists learn about polymers, engineers are able to create solutions using polymers. So that may be plastic glasses, or wouldn't be glass, right? So going from glass to plastic in terms of cups, or more resilient helmets, or so on and so forth. That's sort of the contribution. And if you think about space exploration, there's a great example here of this relationship where engineers design probes that have sensors that can gather the necessary data for scientists, and as a result, scientists are able to collect data to test hypotheses, answering questions that they hadn't had access to before, and also thereby revealing new information which they have new questions about. So keep that in mind. The tool to make this all happen in such a way that it is able to be clearly communicated and also analyzed and replicated is math. Math is that tool. Math is a tool for communication, quantifying, analyzing, evaluating, and communicating. Okay, that's why it's at the center here. And before I move on, this is not just something teachers should be able to tell you, oh, that's science, or this is engineering, and here's why, because that is, we're trying to answer a question, we're developing an experiment in order to yield the data, gather the data that we can use to then reflect on this hypothetical answer, or we're developing a prototype, testing it, and gathering data to then reflect back on if it solves the problem. That's something a teacher should be able to tell you, and it's also something a student should be able to tell you. Because that's the absolute foundation. Like if we have science class and we don't know what science is, that's a real big problem. If we have engineering in our class, we don't know what engineering is and how it relates to science, like, that's a real big problem. So carrying that forward, one of the reasons why science classes in a lot of cases have been able to kind of skate by saying, well, science is natural phenomenon. It's like, well, no, it's not. It's actually knowledge from experimentation. Natural phenomenon has existed prior to scientists. So yeah, traditional models of instruction is content flowing through a teacher who models the facts, explains the phenomenon, explains what something is. And so you can picture the teacher as basically the expert in this situation, handing out the knowledge, and the student, their role is to really try and absorb all of that and be able to repeat it back to show their proficiency, because in a traditional model, that's how proficiency, or at least a large component of proficiency, consists of mirroring back the facts, the demonstrations, and the phenomenon which have been told and demonstrated and summarized. So that's really lower order thinking skill stuff. Just remembering, understanding, and applying. So lower order, think of Bloom's taxonomy. This is not compatible with next generation science standards or next generation inquiry environment. The reason is that in order to develop practices, the practice skills, the science engineering practices, students need to be in an instructional environment where they are given the opportunity to attempt those practices. So essentially engaging in something that's novel, that's not been pre-taught, not been demonstrated, not been told, and to do it systematically in the sense of in conjunction with other practices and multiple areas of content. And that's why these new standards really lend themselves towards scenarios and performance-based testing, because they are performance expectations. The next generation inquiry model changes the dynamics. So you notice the teacher's not between the student and the content anymore in this diagram. The teacher is acting as a coach, not an expert. And the student is developing those science engineering practices, the skills specific to science and engineering, and using them to develop and use the content. So the skills are a tool to access the content and master, and also to observe and connect the phenomena, which are the cross-cutting concepts, to the content, and to see patterns in terms of that, things like cycles, inputs, outputs, viewing systems in terms of their parts and their interactions are all things that are not, just specific to one piece of content. There are many cycles. There were water cycles, rock cycles, life cycles, oxygen cycles, carbon cycles, and so on. They're all cycles. They're actually, the ones I've named are all interrelated. And so that's great, but again, there's, a rock cycle is not a water cycle. So you have to be able to see the relationships and how things are interrelated, but also be able to see the systems themselves. So that's the key aspect of this next generation inquiry environment, is that students should be venturing into, from their perspective, the unknown. And it should still be held to certain high expectations and structure and so on, but this is not a kind of the old plastic kit where you get, you read a whole bunch, you get some materials, and then you fill out a worksheet following some, make by number procedure that's given to students. What that does is that removes the opportunity to learn and to engage in the practices. We'll go into that a little bit more. The next generation inquiry model functions with the teacher as the coach, tuning the inquiry environment, gradually adjusting supports for students, helping students understand how to engage appropriately. I can emphasize that enough, because under a traditional model, that's what students don't understand. They've never had to engage as a scientist or an engineer. They've never really had to use their thinking. They've had to use their remembering. And the teacher helps redirect and monitor. Very student-centered here. In order to demonstrate proficiency, the students have to demonstrate the expectations, and that means developing and using the content, using their science and engineering practice skills to solve problems and answer questions, and to use their understanding of the cross-cutting concepts to be able to relate, understand, and describe the concepts and the way that those concepts actually function. And we'll take a look at how that comes together here in a second. So that's why you see the new standards rendered this way. Okay, the new standards, some people make the mistake of just, okay, this is the standard. That's all we need to pay attention to. Actually, no. That is the performance expectation, and that performance expectation exists basically like a wrinkle in fabric. It exists in these 3 dimensions. Okay, so this is the fabric, the practices that are necessary in order to develop this content, which is the disciplinary core ideas, in order to view the phenomena, which are the cross-cutting concepts. That doesn't mean these are the only practices, the only concepts, and the only content and the only systems that are related, but it means that in order to engage in developing a model to describe the movement of matter among plants, animals, decomposers, and the environment, you can't get away from these core elements, and they're interrelated. Now, one of the issues around the new standards is the idea of grade level specific standards. So they are grade level specific in the sense that students should have mastered those standards by the end of that grade level, but they aren't grade level specific in the sense that those are the only standards you should be teaching in that grade level. And usually, people kind of hang their head a little bit when they hear that, because, this is the way these standards are designed. They're not designed so that you own a standard and that's all you do, and then, the kids ship off to the next guy in the next room over next year. The standards are designed as a system of content and skills and phenomena that are interrelated, and that they should be taught in conjunction with each other. So you're not teaching one standard at a time, but you're actually pooling standards. And the way that you're pooling these standards, you really should be pooling standards from previous and future grades as well, with the purpose of introducing those standards from future grades as part of mastering the standards from your grade, and reinforcing standards from prior grades. The reason that that's so important is on multiple levels. So students actually form those connections and relationships between what they're doing in each year. It's an intentional, thoughtful, nurturing, and scaffolding process the curriculum needs to take. The other thing is that, and also within the year, September through June, there should be this intentional, thoughtful scaffolding. But the other reason to be doing that is, especially the larger, once you go beyond one building in a district, if a student is to move between classrooms or between buildings, they shouldn't end up in a rock and mineral unit second trimester, because that's the way they do it over there, and over here we do it first trimester. That creates a gap. The other issue is that poorly articulated, and that's like kits, do it in this grade span and whatever, things that aren't really tailored to the grade level are so, it's kind of like a, I don't know, it's like a door or window that doesn't fit quite right. Just kind of jiggles in place and it's really sloppy. What happens is the connections between those pieces aren't as obvious and aren't something that students get in a habit of making as easily, and you lose a lot of value with that. Another reason is that as the district gets bigger, typically larger districts tend to have more newcomers. They tend to have more transients, and as a result of newcomers and transients, if you're only giving students exposure to a standard in one grade level, then the best student in the world reaching mastery of their grade level specific standards is going to have a gap from prior years. That also happens when kids go on vacation. They get sick for extended periods of time. Developmentally, they're just a little bit behind their peers because all children are developing at different rates, and you see that especially in K1 too. I mean, it's dramatic. Even up to through, I'd say, 4th grade is really a massive changes, and it happens further beyond that too. But at those early grade levels, to have not constructed your curriculum this way is unfortunate. When you think about the practices, one of the issues that folks are facing as they're implementing the early grade levels and into the beyond that as well, they're under the impression sometimes that the curriculum they have, because it's a light and energy unit, for instance, and there's light and energy in the new standards, that all they have to do is kind of stick the practices in there. And the next generation inquiry environment I just described to you is not exactly something that you can just create by sticking something somewhere. You can't take a traditional, I'm going to tell you about everything, you're going to absorb it, and I'm going to test it that way, and then kind of stick into it these practices. Okay, these are not things that can be taught in isolation. They actually are things that have to be taught together, and you'll see why. The students need, and this is the student skill sets now, these are the skills the students need to be successful with these standards within that practices dimension, and they're applicable K-12. So these skills are going to be skills that kindergartners have as well as 12th graders. They're just going to deepen over time, and the way the students express them is going to become more sophisticated and deeper, and the type of investigations that they create and they're involved in is they're going to involve more variables and so on. So that's what changes. The student needs to be able to ask questions and define problems appropriately in the scientific and engineering context. Not only use models, but develop them. Not only carry out an investigation that's written on the board or numbered pictures, things to create, whatever, but actually plan that investigation. So starting with the problem or question, what's the plan? How do you go from here to an evidence-based conclusion? That's a skill that a student needs to have. Not only interpreting data, but analyzing it. So you have a table full of data that you can try to interpret, but it's not reading tea leaves here. What we're doing is we need to apply our math skills to actually maybe find a mean, a median, a mode, the difference of an average. And that key, say a difference of an average, could be the key support for a claim that I'm going to make, and then reason. Using math, computational thinking, constructing explanations and designing solutions, engaging in argument from evidence. It's really hard to construct an explanation without engaging in an argument from evidence and without obtaining, evaluating, communicating information, and of course analyzing. So you can see how these are all interconnected. Why are we doing any of that? Because we've asked a question, we've developed a model, or we've planned an investigation, and so you see it's all interconnected. Not something that's easily shoehorned in kind of one-off, one at a time. I mentioned those younger classrooms. Here's a couple of second graders. The model that we follow in order to accomplish this. And you can see an example of this if you go to our website, KnowAtom.com, and you click at the top of the screen, STEM curriculum. You can scroll down, and there is a grade level specific curriculum. There's 1 month sample you can take a look at to just see what aligned curriculum looks like from a teacher's perspective, and also student reading pieces from a student's perspective. The kind of cadence, or like an arc, that these students travel in a lesson looks like this. I'll pull it up for you here. So these students are carrying out a plan at this point, but it starts way before carrying out a plan. It starts at nonfiction reading, and in the integration of ELA and math, Common Core is a key pivot or key innovation of the next generation science standards that's required to really be aligned. And you can take a look at that in the peak alignment criteria, PEEC. And it's also, so peak alignment is really looking at more of a district and school level, and then EQUIP rubric for science is looking more at the unit, at the classroom level unit and lesson. The two work together, and you should be using EQUIP rubrics on your own stuff you create too. I think there's some kind of wacky sense that this is for products only, and people forget that that teachers create products. The product of what they create is a, lesson, unit, whatever is a product that you need to really consider with that criteria. So the arc that a lesson travels that I was mentioning earlier when you saw those two students is starting with nonfiction reading. And in our case, the nonfiction reading is taking a concept and anchoring it in a real scenario, a real life. You can Google the Corn Bayou sinkhole, and we're anchoring groundwater and hydrology and different aspects of that in that scenario, and then building one page to the next, scaffolding that idea up, connecting it to the water cycle, the rock cycle, and so on, those sort of things. The purpose of nonfiction reading is just to give some common background and serve as fuel for Socratic dialogue. You can't, there was a bunch of textbook companies and wanted everybody to take a literacy approach to everything because you can sell books this way. And so, there's all kinds of white papers and case studies and research and everything. Under these new standards, you can't, you can't read a book to learn how to ride a bike. In the case of these new standards, you can't read a book to learn skills that are to engage in science and engineering. It doesn't work that way. So the nonfiction reading is just common background, serving for Socratic dialogue. Socratic dialogue takes the place of lecture, if lecture was something that was there before, but nonetheless that's its role. Socratic dialogue is about asking higher order questions, questions that require students to think about that context creatively, analytically, and evaluatively, and respond with the product of that thinking publicly in class. And the teacher is skillfully asking questions to focus on the main key ideas and build on that student thinking, but do so by asking other students questions like, if they would agree with that, how, why, what evidence do they have to support or make a counterclaim, and so on and so forth, with the idea being that you're looping the students' contributions into that sort of arguing from evidence into the kind of public space and involving their peers sort of in that scientific argumentation to consider their ideas, and then you're not validating that as a teacher by saying you're correct or you're incorrect, but you're actually using the students themselves to kind of vet each other's ideas. And the thing is that, and there's a whole hour, we have a How to Hold the Next Generation Socratic Dialogue webinar that's, I'd recommend actually, I think it's really good. It will take you through how that works and actually a model for it and so on. But Socratic dialogue, that's its job. It's to get the students making concept to concept, concept to self, and concept to world connections with what they've read and what's being discussed, and then that becomes a springboard into a problem or question which you can break down into your student teams, and they can advance with what they've discussed and what they've heard from each other and what they've thought themselves, to take that knowledge and extend it in addressing the problem or question that's at hand. And that's where process comes in. So practices and processes are a big part of this. So as a student the student teams develop, students are creating planned investigations. They are planning them. That's how they go from the problem to the evidence-based conclusion or so. So in order to plan an investigation, you need some process skills. You need a logic, and that's the scientific process or the engineering design process. We often call the scientific method sometimes, and some people go, oh, scientific method, that's, old. Science isn't linear. Engineering isn't linear. The scientific process, the engineering design process are not communicating that science or engineering is linear. Process is just logic. It's helping create, and I'll just flash this up here for you so you can see the examples of what scientific and engineering process look like. Kind of a logical framework for students that equips students to be able to navigate the unknown. They apply the practices, the skills, within the process. See, that's the key. So the practices get applied within the processes. Now, the documentation's really light. There's reference and all kinds of things to process, but I think they didn't want to bite off more than they could chew. Unfortunately, without process, just having practice skills is kind of, it's like, being able to walk but being blindfolded. So I want to use an example from writing, because I think this is much easier because people are familiar with writing practices and the writing process. Writing practices are things like word choice, voice, tone, sentence structure. Those are the skills, the tool set that's needed to write effectively. However, you can know everything about sentence structure and all these things, tone, voice, and not be able to construct a high-quality publication. In order to publish high-quality works, written works, you need to engage in a writing process. Writing process is things like brainstorming, followed by drafting, followed by editing, followed by revising, followed by publishing. That basic process is a logic for going from an idea to a high-quality published work. The science and the engineering processes are the logic and framework to go from a question to an evidence-based conclusion, or from a problem to an evidence-based conclusion as to whether or not you would refine or replicate the proposed solution. So the practices would be applied there. Now, when you come back to this, that's what's happening as students plan their investigation. They're using those processes, depending on if they're in the role of scientist or engineer. And then once they have a plan, see, the problem or the question gives a purpose to a plan. And the plan gives a purpose to carrying out that plan, the actual hands-on investigation itself that yields the data, because you're carrying out your plan. Then you use the data to form an evidence-based conclusion, and then you can share it and debrief as a class. So, when I say you, I'm thinking from the student's perspective, the student team. So that's, again, where scientific argumentation, the Socratic dialogue comes into play, and more of those concept to concept, concept to self, concept to world connections. So, at its foundation, NGSS is really, really simple. I mean, this is kind of it. I mean, it's really simple. You can picture this as a week in class, and then next week you have a similar sort of arc, but it's a whole new context and a whole new set of content and a whole new set of phenomena. And the practices are the same, the processes are the same, the expectations of the teacher, of the children, is the same. But now, having used practices and processes, despite there being new content, I have something that I can work with to actually grasp some from that nonfiction reading and the Socratic dialogue, and work with a problem or question to extend my knowledge. And that's really how, at least how we approach it, and it's been very successful. We've seen really amazing games, and I'll show you some of those later. the next generation science standards come with a new definition of effective STEM instruction from the National Research Council, and its movement from what you see on the left, that traditional model of somebody, having fun pre-teaching and showing and demonstrating, to students really being engaged in the practices. As I explained to you earlier, what you see on the right are students in the role of engineer. They went through that process, so they've gone through the reading, Socratic dialogue, and now they're planning their investigation. They're in the role of engineer. They've never seen the answer to the problem they're trying to solve. They have some knowledge related to it, but they're going to use those practices and the process skills to extend what they do know into what they don't know, create a prototype. So they have to look at the available materials, decide on an approach that uses some subset of that, diagram it, build it, test it. The test yields data. They're going to use that data to reflect back on what they created and then share it with their peers and see the peers' approaches and kind of make that comparison. Engineering's not about building. Engineering's not creating something and not actually testing it and having that test yield data. You're just crafting. And things that are engineered are not always physical either. Construction workers build things. Engineers design prototype solutions. Sometimes that's a process, which is non-physical. Sometimes it's a software program, non-physical. Sometimes it's a doorstop, non-electronic. So these are all examples of technology. So picture a shift from what you see on the left, where the students are trying to remember and then go back and repeat what they've seen, to what you see on the right, where students are trying to take their skills and use them to solve a problem. Okay, just like swinging at a baseball or something like that. You take your skills and you try to achieve a goal. Effective science instruction, this is the definition from the National Research Council, capitalizes on students' early interests and experiences. So starting in kindergarten, pre-K, and following, all the way up, not just when, the test kicks in. Identifying and builds on what students know, which means it's an intentional nurturing process year to year, but also within the year, as I described earlier. Provides students with experiences to engage them in the practices of science and sustain their interest. And so when you think about that, it's really engaging in, it's the practices of science are those skills again. So what is the context for that experience and how the student is essentially in a scenario where the skills are required, and is that scenario and the skills required sustaining student interest? So picture that there as the having a rigorous scope and sequence, having the students' ideas. So carrying out what somebody else has told you is not nearly as engaging as carrying out your own ideas. And so that's part of sustaining interest, right? Not the 3-month unit of, rocks and minerals or earth science or something like that. So think about that as you picture that classroom environment again that I kind of had showed you earlier, whether it's the 2nd grade level or something a bit beyond that. The result of students engaging in planning, generating a nonfiction text, process writing, and evidence-based writing, and so on, is that they're engaging those ELA skills, they're engaging the math skills, particularly the math practices and the ELA technical subject standards, communication standards, writing standards, the nonfiction reading, and so on. Creating, evaluating, and analyzing is something that crosses over all these disciplines as well as others. The only thing that science and experimenting, is science time on learning only is experimenting and prototyping. The key thing to remember here is that when you think about Bloom's taxonomy, those creative, evaluative, and analytical thinking skills are happening simultaneously, right? So that's what's happening here. They have to create a plan, they have to evaluate the question, they have to analyze, they have to carry out their plan, analyze the results, evaluate it, evaluate their solution, and so on. When you look at the models of testing now, the DC is a great example to look at because they were first in the nation to have a statewide NGSS aligned standardized assessment. It assesses multiple grade levels, open response, multiple choice, open response, multiple choice, as well as these tech enhanced items. the items themselves are scenarios, whether it's constructed response, and oftentimes there's a theme where fictional students and sort of an overarching theme that carries through multiple test items that tease out different aspects of the 3 dimensions. The students are engaged in this scenario, sort of considering it as scientists. So that's again where process gets involved. Process is something that helps students understand whether a claim that's being made or something that's been done here is illogical, is kind of a leap. And so here a couple of fictional students are growing seeds. They've heard about hydroponics, so they're interested about growing them in water only versus soil in a more traditional way. They gather data as scientists and they form claims, but the claims have insufficient support. So the real student who's being tested here is being asked whose claim is correct, Trevor or Kayla, and explain how and why that claim is correct. Use evidence to support it. So a student has to be able to go in and evaluate and analyze and make their own claim, and then pull out not pull out, but really analyze, so develop the support for their own claim and reason it in writing. The tech-assisted items here, these are kind of a drag and drop. So the students have to look at the organisms and drop them into their proper place in the food web, and then do a constructed response explaining the shortest path for energy to travel from plants to the fox. In a multiple choice, now multiple choices questions are, they're not one answer, choose the one single correct answer out of 4, but in fact it's select the 3 out of 6 or the 3 out of 5. And it requires being able to understand and use that model. Beyond that, it's also using that model to consider how there's a relationship between these organisms and exchanging matter back into the environment. So for instance, a life cycle, if a minnow dies, that matter is recycled back into the environment with the help of the bacteria. Bacteria are decomposers, making that available again to the environment to be taken up. And that's actually a food chain. So we have a food web here as well when you start to consider the life cycle and the role of bacteria, decomposers, and such. Other examples of multiple choice you see here, 3 correct out of 5 answers based on a scenario. Again, Kayla, Trevor show up. This is talking about matter being recycled through composting. Over here, that the idea that animals eat plants and such, and so they have to think about the connection between, or really a way of solving the problem of moles eating plants in the garden. It has to meet certain criteria, and there is a data table of solutions, data on solutions. That student has to create a constructive response using that information. So again, much more of a next generation environment. It's building on what the students know, it's engaging them in the practices, and it's sustaining their interest by changing, from one item to the next. So in a sense, these new assessments in a way kind of model through little vignettes effective STEM instruction in some ways. So one of the key pivots here in the NGSS for curriculum and instruction has to do with bringing science and engineering together in the classroom. So science is all about knowledge from experimentation, trying to answer questions. So here's an example from grade 7 where the students have read about and discussed water cycle, earth materials, groundwater, aquifers, that sort of thing. And then they jump into a question where they try to answer what earth materials are most permeable to groundwater, and they develop an experiment, gather data, form a conclusion about it. In the next lesson, they extend that knowledge to pollution in the air and in the water, in the soil, and so on. And they consider the system, how those parts interact. And as engineers, they can take that scientific knowledge and the knowledge of that phenomenon and engage in engineering a solution to water pollution for a fictional town here that needs a low-cost water filtration device that's able to remove pollutants. And so they engage in the engineering design process, gather their data and so on, and come to results about each of their prototypes. And as they create a prototype, if it doesn't meet the needs of the problem, they go back at that. So keep in mind that that anything that we're teaching, any of those dimensions, the performance expectations, all of this need to be assessed, not only at a state level, but actually at a classroom level. So at a classroom level, what you should be, the kind of assessments you're creating should really look a lot like those assessments that I showed you earlier from DC, those items. And by the way, DC is lending these items out to a lot of different states. So, maybe coming to a classroom near you from DC, because that's a great shortcut that Illinois used and some others to be able to kind of leap over testing items that they create themselves and try to get the items tweaked to where they need to be, and instead jump right into sort of an aligned assessment that may not count at first, but then does count later on. So nonetheless, the assessments in the classroom should kind of model that unfamiliar context. Context is not the result of direct instruction, and then using layered questioning that require those practices and knowledge of the concepts and all of that to combine in different ways in order to tease out whether the student has mastered all these dimensions. And then even sometimes inserting new information to challenge a student's assumptions. So all of that you can see is requiring in the classroom assessment, in the classroom experience, and so on. State assessments require ELA technical subject standards be applied, as well as math practices. So things like following precisely a multi-step procedure is ELA, actually. It's not science. Science is creating the multi-step procedure. Expressing information visually, using evidence citing evidence to support analysis, and so on. And on the math side, making sense of problems, persevering in solving them, reasoning abstractly, constructing viable arguments, attending to precision, making use of structure. All these things are skills that they're learning through math, but also are applicable to the science environment. So when you think about the resources that you're developing, or the resources that you're keeping, or the resources that you're buying, you have to think about the different levels that resources fall into, and there's not a lot at a mastery level right now. Most of them are kind of at a knowledge and performance level, and a whole boatload at an awareness level. Awareness resources are just simple, downloadable. You get them from public venues like museums, you get them from the internet, companies that use science, whatever. Just make students aware of what a scientist or engineer is, that kind of a thing, what you get out of a field trip. Knowledge readiness is about, it's like what textbooks do. So paragraphs that explain words and put really, pretty pictures with them, or in fact, these could be electronic things, pictures you can click on or spin around and, connect or whatever. The knowledge readiness is kind of backward looking. It's what scientists have discovered and what engineers have developed. Performance-ready resources are resources which teach students how to carry out specific tasks related to the discipline. So, you learn all about the rocks and minerals, and then you learn how to carry out a hardness test or a streak test or that sort of thing. That's what happens with performance-ready resources. Mastery-ready resources are the resources that aim at equipping students with skills and knowledge and connection to the phenomena, such that they can enter an unfamiliar situation, make sense of it, use the skills to actually form their own analysis and claim about that situation, actually support it with evidence and reason it out. Okay, and that's the examples I was giving earlier from the testing show really that mastery readiness is required. And so in the classroom, you have to picture students being put into those scenarios in order to develop mastery readiness, not just sort of isolated as a culminating task or something like that. I mentioned about these skills and art. So art is engineered communication. It's not about aesthetics. It's not about making things pretty. That's why artists get in trouble. They go to jail sometimes in the wrong places and at the wrong times, because frankly, they're making statements, and sometimes those statements are not popular. And Pablo Picasso and Guernica are a great example. Pablo Picasso had to live in exile because he was an artist. He made statements. Those statements were not always popular, and he lived in a place and a time where he could be jailed or worse for having made those, some claims. And his work, Guernica, was really created to show to the world and make a statement to the world and to the fascists that what's happening at Guernica is noticed and that people need to get involved and to stop these atrocities. And so you can see, Pablo Picasso's most famous work is not that pretty. It's in a style that's identifiably his, but nonetheless, it's not pretty. It's just not. And yet it's very high-level communication. And when the fascists saw this, they came back to him and said, "Hey, what did you do?" And as it's, the story is told, he said to them, "I didn't do it, but you did." And so artists are trained within a culture of critique. Scientists and engineers are trained within a culture of critique. Your classroom should be a culture of critique. The science and engineering practices, those skills that are sharpening and involving students' higher order thinking skills, are necessary to be excellent communicators, and that's what artists are. They also equip children to be able to communicate and receive communication better, but also consume art and create art more precisely as well. So it's really a lot of vital connection here. So when you think about your art class, don't think about the color wheel. Think about, how am I teaching children to communicate in a medium? Whether it's oil on canvas or sculpture or watercolor, whatever it is. Are we making things pretty, or are we trying to say something? What is it we're trying to say? That's what art is about, and that's where where these connections happen. So think about the STEM learning environment as needing support from the curriculum, from the professional development that's transferring those traditional skill sets over, and from the materials that are required to execute the lessons. Okay. And if you want to take, like I said, if you want to look at any of our stuff, it's available online. Those data outcomes I was mentioning earlier, you can see here 20% high needs, 7% low income. The state average is 50%, and these guys went from average to well above average over the course of just 2 years, and they've been able to sustain it over time. These guys here, inner city, again, same state. We're going to use Massachusetts as an example. 50% is the average proficiency level for an elementary school here. And this school, whose 35% first language is not English, 72% low income, 65% free lunch, 75% high needs, and these folks over 2.5 years, they moved their scores 51 points. They went from well below the state average to well above it, almost double. And you see these ups and downs because there are shocks, changes in teacher, changes in administration, so on, but you can see these children don't fall all the way back to the original levels because those skills are actually supporting them. They're able to think their way through and use their prior exposure, prior knowledge to connect and still score. At a middle school level, one at the bottom in the state, only 4% proficient. You can see over the course of 2 years they add 24 points to their advanced and proficient scoring students, and they now actually, unfortunately, this is the truth, right? They're now performing at the level of their peers in the other 26 largest cities in Massachusetts. And the key thing I want to point out here is that that basic, below basic level, warning failing, it was cut in half. And it was, a difficult environment. You can look at the data here. 64% first language is in English, 95% low income, 87% free lunch, and 97% high needs. You could stack the cards in a different direction if you wanted an ideal environment, and yet the gains are possible, and you can create these positive trends and such. So the kind of thinking about the the role of curriculum and its effect on children's learning outcomes, it's really important to think about the the fact that language and income and free lunch status and such aren't a barrier. There may be a challenge because they're markers perhaps for other social challenges or something or whatnot, resource availability, but there's no reason for there to be 4% proficiency, and in fact we can get students to much greater levels, and that's the example here, right? There's no need to be 36% advanced and proficient. You can get to 87%. It doesn't mean you'll always stay there, but you can get to 87%. You can probably get beyond that as well. And we see that in multiple states. Here's an example from New Hampshire. Our folks are in yellow and purple, pink and the teal here. So these are just different years, but the purple is being compared to pink at the state level, and our folks in yellow are being compared to the state in teal. And this is under a non-aligned assessment, just using, again, that next generation model and skills and such that they're outperforming the state levels by 20–30% across the board. So with that said, I appreciate your time, and I want to let you know about a few things. One is another webinar you may want to check out, Strategically Implementing the NGSS. You can get to that. It's free, KnowAtom.com/strategically. If you have any questions about research, things that we've talked about, or resources you've downloaded, or anything else, feel free to reach out to Mary Ellen DeLacy if you want to get a hold of me. I know there's some questions. I'm not going to, unfortunately, have time to take those, but I'll get to you back to you online. If you don't get your questions answered, you're watching this on demand, feel free to reach out to Mary Ellen and send those questions along. My name's Francis, and if you let her know you'd like to get a question to me, she'll do that, and I will respond personally to that as well. And the last few resources, stay connected. Follow us on our blog, KnowAtom.com/blog, Facebook.com/KnowAtom, and Twitter @KnowAtom is our handle. You can get some case studies, and I mentioned the month-long curriculum and reader samples. And under our resources section, you will find additional resources like ebooks, webinars, interviews with innovators, a million different things that will help support your transition to the next generation science standards and really mastering what these standards require as Oregon moves forward and you all move forward implementing K-12 and iterating your OAKS assessment to a next generation assessment. I hope this has been a useful and valuable time for you. I look forward to seeing you again at another webinar. Feel free to reach out with those questions, and we hope to work with you at some point someday. We'll take care. Bye-bye.